to the Dermatology Voice of Authors. This is a set of videos produced by TalkMED, and it is a program which invites leading authors across dermatology from around the world to give us their expert opinion and perspectives based on a recent paper. I think you alluded to this, but the really exciting thing about the paper and biosimilars is the prospect of getting care which is effective to people who aren't getting the care now, so the access to care question. And in the paper, there's this argument talking about essentials medicines list as one of the couple of things, three things that should improve alongside more dermatologists to diagnose patients and get a treatment to them, but also public awareness. You alluded to the fact that we hope that from the WHO essentials list, it then gets adopted nationally. What do you think is going to happen now with this change in the next couple of years? And what do we need to do as a community building on this success with the essentials list to really get these medicines at the hands of people who need it?
I think this is an extraordinarily important question, for we are not done with the paper. The paper is the beginning of our action, actually. And with respect to getting access to biologics, it struck me, 1 year ago, I was in Mexico. I gave a talk there on treatment of psoriasis, and actually biologics were not available, actually. It was really, they were available in some patients, but there was not a structure where there was adequate reimbursement. So it had not a special, it had really not a position in the treatment paradigm of psoriasis. And actually, I discussed then with a few colleagues that it is on the essential medication list with respect to the biosimilars. And I brought them in contact with a producer of biosimilars. And within 6 weeks, I received a very nice email saying that they had convinced the authorities and that actually they have now adalimumab available. So they started there with adalimumab. And I was very glad of that. But I realized myself at the same time that we should first realize as dermatologists all over the world that we have opportunity. That is, the WHO is behind us. Of course, the local healthcare authorities will ask also, and that is my information from some African countries, that they want data. They want, with respect to the frequency of psoriasis, respect also to health economic data are important. Value-based healthcare is important, but also the international standard. The fact that the WHO is behind us, that what is needed is that dermatologists, but also the patient representatives from the patient association should speak up and should say this is not acceptable anymore, that we don't have availability of biologics in our country. So one thing what should happen is indeed speaking up and knowing that it should be possible to get these drugs available. I have the impression that also the companies of the producers of biosimilars are quite willing to be of support and really to help here. Nowadays, it's not acceptable anymore that on a large base we prescribe systemic corticosteroids for the treatment of psoriasis. But when I give masterclasses in Africa, that is one of the top drugs which is used in the treatment of psoriasis, which is absolutely not safe. And therefore, we really need actually to have availability here of the biosimilars. But one thing with respect to research in psoriasis and underserved areas, I think it is crucial that we get data. And there is the Global Psoriasis Atlas, who are doing fantastic work under leadership of Chris Griffith, who really gather the data on actually psoriasis, the frequency of psoriasis, the comorbidities, the impact of the disease, and also the insight that active treatments really are important. But for us as dermatologists, I think it's important to speak up and really to urge that we get access to biosimilars.
Really interesting, and it really urges us to do more advocacy. One thing that came out of that answer was you mentioned that some nations want more data. And looking at this particular systematic review, it's slightly surprising to me that there were only 17 studies and only 2 studies that got pulled through that were relevant. And both of these studies are from high-income countries, mainly basing their modeling on short-term trial data and those kind of data. What other evidence do you think, what data do we need to really get access to the countries that really need these medicines, do you think?
Yeah, what I think is what we need actually, and I hope that we get that organized in Africa. In Tanzania, there is now a great initiative, and in Kenya also, that is patient registries. So to get actually information on detailed information on the current use of treatments, mentioning actually what the state of art at the moment is. This gives us a reality test that something really has got to be done. So, and it is attractive to do. It gives information to the dermatologists. It are forms of research which are doable also in underserved countries to get that information, to get meaningful information. I think that what's done in the Global Psoriasis Atlas is crucial. That provides also a sort of a forum of an exchange and to get through good epidemiological data. But I think we need also to convince the biosimilar industries that we also get comparative trials actually in underserved areas of the world. For as you say, largely this is done in high economy countries. And it is so important to actually do this. But also related to skin, to darker skin tones, we have to realize that patients with darker skin, the erythema is underestimated. And we can falsely think that the PASI score is quite low, but the patient can have a very substantial psoriasis. And I think it is important to realize this. Also, it's important to realize the post-inflammatory hyper and hypopigmentation, which can be quite impressive. And this can be quite discriminating in people with darker skin tones. So I think we need clinical data from other areas of the world than the well-known North America and Europe trials in order to get an estimate of the realistic impact of the disease for people all over the world. The other thing is that in the pricing of the biosimilars, there is heterogeneity. It varies from country to country. I was amazed myself enormously that there was such a difference between the actually price of adalimumab in a country like the Netherlands, where we had a 90% reduction of the price. And when I gave a talk in Egypt, there was only a reduction there of about 10% as compared to the originator product. And that was the result of the fact that there is the marketing principles which actually determine the pricing. And I think it is very important to realize that based on our solidarity with respect to underserved low-income countries, that in these countries, biosimilars should become available at prices which are realistic prices also in our countries, but not the reverse. Not that actually there is hardly any price reduction in these countries. I was amazed and I was shocked by that. I have the impression that that is changing, but nevertheless, with respect to the negotiation of pricing, I think it is important that pricing should indeed take into consideration the fact that in these countries, price means a lot in the access to care.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that perspective about more clinical data locally. And we really do need to consider this probably unwarranted variation in biosimilar costs around the world. So pivoting on this global perspective now, I'd like to go to a topic that I think the audience of this video would be very interested in, and that's new emerging markets like China. And it's really interesting what's happening in China, and there's an article that was referenced within this particular article as well. There are biosimilars, which are helping access to care, but there's also their own kind of innovative biologics of the same targets, maybe targeting interleukin 17, 23, and some people have termed this bioparallels. So they're not the same products, but they are targeting some of the same targets as the ones that we use in the high income countries. What do you think the impact of this kind of new market and new production of biosimilars and bioparallels are? Do they have the potential, for example, of impacting that variation to costs in other countries as well? What do you see happen in the future to these various new ways of marketing drugs?
Yeah, it's not easy to answer that question in a simple way. That is, the terminology biosimilar is quite clear. It is similar to the drug, and it has the same characteristics with respect to the biophysical aspect. There are pathways also for testing, and then at the end, the healthcare authorities say this is a biosimilar to adalimumab, and we approve. And then we know there is interchangeability. You can interchange the biosimilar with the originator product, great. But now, what you mentioned, there are two, I think, other pathways. One pathway is the so-called biomimics. That is, it is just indeed meant to be a copy of, for example, adalimumab, of an originator, but it has not gone through the whole pathway. And we should be very much aware whether we are dealing with a biomimic or a biosimilar. And a biomimic is actually characterized by the fact that there's no guarantee about the clinical investigations behind this. So about the dossier, about efficacy, but particularly safety. And I would be reluctant with respect to the biomimics. And I think it's very important to realize that this is different from a biosimilar, and I'm very positive about biosimilar, was the process behind it. But then, indeed, in China, for example, there are developed new drugs for the same target. And that is, of course, I would regard that as a new drug. And if the dossier is complete with all its necessary requirements with respect to mode of action, toxicology, efficacy, safety, I'm fine with that. And the question is whether it's feasible that these drugs, these new drugs, will contribute to lower prices. You increase, of course, the competition, and competition always is good to get prices down a bit and to foster quality. So biomimics, I'm very negative about that. And with new drugs with the same target, but you may ask, does it make sense? For we have already a drug with that target. And then I think it often makes sense, really, For we know this also from the anti-IL-17s. For example, ixekizumab and secukinumab, they have more or less the same target, but there are differences with respect to binding affinity, maybe the position where the drug interferes with the target structures, elimination half-life, and so on. And as patients with psoriasis can be very different, may differ very much from each other, in my experience, it could be that secukinumab is not working so well in a patient. You give the patient ixekizumab and you get a great response. So drugs here may be very different. So it makes sense to develop indeed new compounds which are focused on the same targets. That is a contribution. Whether that really leads to substantial less costs, I'm just wondering. I think that the biosimilar process really is a well-developed process and can lead to a substantial reduction of cost, but we have to remain alert. And alert means that the designation that the drug is a biosimilar, that in itself has an enormous value, for that means that this drug is interchangeable with originator products.
Yeah, very, very interesting discussion and, a fascinating area. So thank you so much for your insights. For the final kind of section, I'd like to pivot a little bit back to talking about ambition and treatment effect versus cost effectiveness. And we've talked a lot about access to care in low income and middle income countries. But do you think now that biosimilars are firmly embedded in a lot of places, do you think we should be using these drugs smarter, maybe earlier, even when, in the high income countries, so that we could get to a better treatment effect for more patients?
Yes, I think so. I think that when we look to the real world data on the registries, and Bio registry is a very, of course, a huge database. The PSOBEST in Germany and the PSOLAR in the United States, and in many countries there are registries. And actually, there is no cumulative toxicity. Actually, there is the side effect profile looks really good. And the efficacy, we are dealing with sustainable disease control in a way. And when I compare a drug like adalimumab with methotrexate, cyclosporin, acitretin, dimethyl fumarate, so when I compare this with the classical systemics, often I've thought that if price would not mean any problem, then I would move much earlier to biologic treatment. And now price is coming in the direction. Of course, methotrexate still is less expensive, and methotrexate has a huge, we have huge experience. But with adalimumab, we also have about 25 years experience in real world studies. And we have collected the data in these registries. We are so well informed, I think, about the long-term efficacy and the long-term safety. We know this drug in the meantime quite well. And the same holds true for ustekinumab. So with these biosimilars, when they run out of patent, we have huge real-world information. And for me, actually, it means that's actually a more early onset of starting with biologics is important. And still, I go for, if possible, classical systemic first. That is, I often ask myself the question, is this patient in a hurry or not? And when this patient is not in a hurry, then we can say, well, okay, we start with a classical systemic, we see what the improvement is, but important, one thing, we should define treatment failure better. That is, we have in IPC defined treatment failure now for topical therapies, but I think also for systemic therapies, we need to define treatment failure, that we say in our professional statutes, we say that a certain period of time, and then we don't see a certain PASI, that means failure. And that means that we as professionals want then to go to the next step. And I think that this should be more embedded in our treatment strategy. What exactly that definition of failure, it's more difficult to answer. For we have also, of course, a personalized care in our approach. And maybe the treatment targets can differ from patient to patient, but overall, we agree that we should be very ambitious. So my personal view is when you have not succeeded within half a year time to reach a PASI 90, that is a serious consideration to say we should not continue with this drug. We should go for the next step. And now we have actually options which are available. And that's the first step could be a biosimilar. And personally, I would say if actually we see sort of a psoriasis where we expect that we need the most powerful treatment, just for reason that we have the impression that this patient has a very active psoriasis, or when we have the situation that the life of this patient, the patient really cannot stand this psoriasis anymore. I think then we should be able earlier on to go to the anti-IL-17s and anti-IL-23s, just as a faster track to strive for the best possible efficacy. So in answer to your question, I think what changed in our approach to the systemic treatment of psoriasis is nowadays we can permit ourselves really to set targets that should be reached. And when these are not reached, we should really then go to the next step and not an always wait and see. Also, I know some dermatologists where I give a lot of these master classes, and then in between we talk a lot about how we manage psoriasis. And some colleagues, also good friends of me, say, Peter, they say, when the patient is satisfied, I'm satisfied too. I said, well, do you mean that if the patient, for example, has no itch anymore, but still is covered with psoriasis and is happy for that reason, that you are satisfied too? Yes, they say. Then I'm satisfied too. Why being more ambitious than the patient asks? And that's wrong. That is absolutely wrong. So I would like to convince all of you to say, let's really strive for active intervention, that really we strive for clear, nearly clear skin. We should realize when a patient has actually psoriasis covered over more than 10% of the body surface, then most likely this patient is more endangered to develop comorbidities, including psoriatic arthritis, including cardiovascular disease. And further, we know there are a lot of patients who have learned to live with their psoriasis and that they need actually to get some extra support from us. Really trust also that nowadays we have treatments available who can do the job better. And then I think we have fantastic drugs now with a long-standing, well-documented record of high efficacy and high safety approaching lower prices.
Wow, that was a fantastic, comprehensive summary, taking us all the way from access to care, market, biosimilars, bioparallels, biomimics, right the way to treat to target and disease severity. It's been a really enjoyable discussion of this, really important topic. So thank you so much for joining us, Professor. And it's been really insightful to hear, and hopefully the audience has learned one or two things as well. I'd like to draw the interview to a close. So thanks so much again for your time.
Good. Thank you so much. What a pleasure, Zenas. Thank you.